So let's get one thing ironed out right off the bat here. I'm not making this video in some sort of loser, the medieval times were actually great and nothing was wrong type of move, because no. My goal here is to help you complexify and add nuance to your view of the Middle Ages. They were not, in fact, the Dark Ages, which is honestly just a bullshit term made up during the Enlightenment era to make those writers feel good about themselves. It was a period of 1,000 years, guys. Use your heads. The fact is that in many ways, we're not superior to the people of past eras, and certainly not the Middle Ages. A lot of the problems that we criticize medieval people for are still problems that our society deals with today. Anti-Semitism, racism. A great deal of how we perceive the Middle Ages hinges on a view of the period created by philosophers and historians during the Enlightenment period, all the way through the Victorian era, but more recent and evidence-based research actually rebukes a lot of what we formerly held to be historical canon. As History Today writes, the term Dark Ages found a foothold in the 17th and 18th centuries, with historians like Edward Gibbon writing about the darkness of the period, and reached its peak in the mid-19th century as, with a fervent belief in the dawn of a modern age, a growing empire needed to build a dark past from which to emerge. The Dark Ages cling to Victorian ideals. This period of nearly 1,000 years was, in fact, not as dark as you think it was, especially when you leave the realm of Europe. Anyways, let's get into it. Here are 6 things you probably think are true about the Middle Ages, and why you're wrong. Everyone's mental image of the medieval villagers probably looks a lot like the filth collectors from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but the truth is that medieval people did, in fact, bathe. Yes, even the Christians. The concept of water carrying sickness into the body through the pores showed up much later during the Enlightenment and Renaissance. Not so enlightened now, are we, boys? Many early modern to Victorian scholars operated on the basic idea that time moves in a linear line of progression, so if things are currently or recently bad, they must have been worse before. So they saw doctors and such saying, "Don't bathe in water, it makes you sick," and thought, yeah, this must mean that medieval people never bathed. Instead of bathing in water, many people in post-medieval early modern centuries, starting with the 16th century, would do what's called a dry bath that still involved soap. We know medieval people weren't worried about water doing this because we have writings from the era talking about treating sick people with baths. So here's the thing. Human beings are human beings. We have always wanted to be clean, to feel good, to smell good. Medieval people aren't some separate species entirely, and to judge medieval hygiene with contempt is, first of all, an enormous position of privilege. We know infinitely more today about pathogens and illness, and have the technology and convenience to be able to take a hot shower multiple times a day if we wanted to. At least, most of us can. And in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to bathe, you had a few options. You could haul the water to your house, heat it up, and then take a bath, which would take forever and require a lot of muscle and resources, often where you might not live in a place with easy access to a lot of clean water. You might have to make the choice then between bathing or having clean water to drink and cook with. The other option was to bathe in cold water, which only cuts out one step, or bathe in a natural body of water if you had access to one. And we know people often did this because it was an extremely common occurrence for people to drown while bathing. So let's cut them a bit of slack here, okay? That said, yes, people did bathe on a regular, semi-daily basis if it wasn't a full immersed bath like the one that I just talked about. The more frequent situation was filling a bowl with water and using soap, yes, soap, to scrub down the cloth. Considering what I just discussed about how time-consuming and difficult a full bath was, this simpler and less water-consuming option was the routine go-to. But if you want the nice experience of a full bath, and most people did, you may have gone down to the local bathhouse. The medieval period directly followed the fall of the Roman Empire, and if you know anything about the Romans, you know that the Romans loved to bathe. The Roman Empire left bathhouses everywhere, and when the empire fell, those bathhouses didn't just disappear. People still used them. These bathhouses usually took advantage of natural hot springs, so they were super popular and provided a pretty luxurious experience where people could sit in barrel-like bathtubs with a linen tent draped over it and enjoy the steam, or just sitting in the hot spring itself. Like a medieval bath bomb, people would sprinkle minerals and flower petals into the water to make it smell good. People even ate dinner in the bathhouses. Now here's a fun aside about the bathhouse rules. See, bathhouses have always been a sort of haven for, let's just say, homosexual activity. I mean, come on, right? Obviously, when you're two bros chilling in a bathhouse, things are bound to happen. It also attracted a lot of sex workers, so this led to a lot of people warning people away from the bathhouses for moral reasons. But, like, the baths are so nice and cozy and fun and luxurious. Can't stay away too long. Now, the rules people did listen to were about the separation of religious groups. Jewish, Muslim, and Christian people all had separate bathhouses, and there were other various reasons for this, but the main one was that the church simply didn't want the mixing of ideas, ooh. If you get a bunch of people of differing religions naked together in a casual setting and just hanging out, then, oh god, what if they start talking and become friends and realize that they're not so different after all? And maybe non-Christians aren't evil, suspicious villains? What a concept. So no, not allowed. Sorry. And on the part of the Jewish and Muslim population, religious reasons aside, they definitely would want their own bathhouses because if the community already hates you and wants to do a violence to you, the last place you want to be with them is in a place where you're naked, so... People had a way of brushing their teeth that often involved putting coarse salt on a hazel branch and using it like a toothbrush, or using coarse fabric and tooth powder. Kind of like those old, finger toothbrush things. Do y'all remember those? Only early 2000s kids remember. To freshen breath, people chewed on mint leaves and cloves and used picks to floss. They weren't actually as much at risk for cavities as we are today because their diets consisted of far, far less sugar than ours. I mean, they lost teeth for other reasons, but still. Soap was extremely common, and most commonly made from lye, as many soaps today are. Those with more cash to drop bought the milder olive oil soaps, or Castile soap. And a form of perfume existed too, commonly made of warm rose water and herbs. Now, when it comes to laundry, this is where people of the past are honestly more clever than we are in many aspects. For centuries of history, a full outfit consisted of a full layer of undergarments, a usually linen chemise or shift, or undershirt, and stockings. These garments would take the brunt of sweat, dirt, and body oil, so they could be easily washed on a regular basis, and the outer garments could be tended to less frequently. It saved water, time, and energy, and when the laundry was done, they might dry the items on a fragrant bush to make them smell nice. So, no. People didn't stink as much as you thought they did. How are you going to woo Katherine down at the local inn if you're stinky? It's in Northern Europe where full bathing tended to be on an even less frequent basis for Christians. Jewish and Muslim people followed strict religious codes that required frequent bathing, but in the realm of Christianity, if you bathed too often, it could be considered a sign of vanity and overindulgence. And reminder, when I say bathing here, I don't mean the daily scrub down, I mean the sitting in a luxurious bath. Pleasure in general was kind of in the bad zone for medieval Christianity because it was considered diverting your focus from God. Even straight married couples were discouraged from having sex for any reason other than procreation. Not that people listened, but you know. This is the exact reason why the church kept being like, I don't know guys, don't go to the bathhouses as much. It's because both men and women were openly naked there. And who else frequented the bathhouses? Sex workers. Can't be having people getting down in there for reasons other than procreation. Plus, some people of very devout faith believed that not taking full-on luxurious baths and feeling the discomfort of the body was a way to remind themselves that the mortal form is transient and fleeting. But this was fairly uncommon because, again, people like to feel good. And medieval people weren't a religious monolith. Most of the references we have to that sort of belief is in references to saints who, well, they did a lot of really intense stuff to show their devotion to God and can't really be grouped in with every religious person. It's commonly believed that monks especially didn't bathe because there really was a belief that naked celibate young men shouldn't bathe together, but abbeys and monasteries did have bathhouses for each class of the system, and the monks were expected to bathe. They were even provided with a piece of soap, every single one of them. It was a common rule that even if the monks were told to refrain from taking a full-on bath, they still needed to clean themselves with soap, water, and a cloth, just like everyone else. Some larger monasteries even employed bath attendants. So yes, they bathed. Despite living a life of service to God and the all too prevalent idea of earthly pleasures being sinful, And let's be real here. With all of our modern knowledge and privileges, there are still plenty of people today who willingly go days and days and days without bathing and sit in their filth and stink. I'm sure you can think of a few, especially if you've ever ridden public transportation in the summer. Stankiness, for whatever reason, is a human experience regardless of time period. And before you say anything about the bubonic plague, I swear that needs to be its own video or something, because that whole deal made things even more complicated. I mean, there were a few people that tried to hide from the plague by living in the sewer and eating poo-poo, so I can't get into it today, dude. I just can't. That said, yes, people in the medieval era took full-on tub of water baths far, far less than we do today due to the lack of access to water, how it was considered indulgent by the church, etc., but they did still bathe and had more regular cloth, soap, and water bathing rituals that got the job done perfectly adequately. And yeah, especially in the cities, the sanitization situation wasn't fantastic, which is why city planners worked so fast to get the streets cobbled. People of the medieval era themselves were quite aware when something was gross or stank. They didn't ignore it. One writer around 1200 wrote of Paris's evil odor, which I would argue never went away. So, despite their numerous disadvantages given the situation of their time period, they did do their best to manage it. The notion that medieval people believed the earth was flat can be attributed to a few different things. One being a story about Christopher Columbus written in 1828 by Washington Irving. And by story, I mean literal novel. But we know that medieval people knew that the earth was round because of all the documents we have from the time. These people were very good at math, you see. Especially when you, again, move outside of Europe. Arab scholars were developing new systems of math all the time, and many of those systems were built off of the systems previously developed by the ancient Greeks. In the absence of electric lights to pollute the night sky, these people had a very clear view of the stars, and the path of the stars was not only predictable, but well documented. Plus, the night sky dominated the reasoning of many aspects of people's lives. Not only were the stars used to navigate the world physically and understand its layout, but astronomy, and more importantly, astrology, were used as vital aspects of medicine. The 9th century Arab astronomer Ahmad al-Farghani wrote that ships didn't simply drop off the horizon, they slowly sink down. Many other scholars, such as Robert Bacon, described that the Earth was a sphere too. And we know that the idea of Earth as a sphere was common in the church too, due to the amount of symbolic representations of the planet as an orb. Stephen Jay Gould wrote in 1997 that there never was a period of flat Earth darkness among scholars, regardless of how the public at large may have conceptualized our planet both then and now. Greek knowledge of sphericity never faded, and all major medieval scholars accepted that Earth's roundness was an established fact of cosmology. Ancient Greek figures such as Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Eratosthenes wrote that the spherical form of the Earth, and in The Reckoning of Time by Bede from the 7th to 8th century, the Earth is described as an orb, and it is not merely circular like a shield or spread out like a wheel, but resembles more a ball. Shiloh Carroll writes, take 19th century French philosopher Auguste Comte, whose theory of positivism says that human intellectual and social development happened in a straight line from Neanderthal to his own image of a refined gentleman. Claims like this fundamentally, and in some cases purposefully, misunderstand the historical records so that the perpetrators can feel superior to the past, and were often used to justify racism, colonialism, and imperialism. These scholars would cherry-pick their sources, like hyper-focusing on the writings of Cosmas and Lactantius, who weren't even writing in the medieval era, which did argue for a flat Earth model. But even then, these two weren't remotely as influential as they were made out to be. And the crafty myth of Christopher Columbus being this scrappy little hero fighting against a bunch of flat earther idiots in the name of progress and knowledge completely overwrites the truth of him being straight up just a genocidal freak. Of course, people did believe that the Earth was the center of the universe. More specifically, that Jerusalem was the center of the universe. Many medieval maps show Jerusalem at the center, literally because God, and therefore Jerusalem, was the center of medieval people's personal worlds too. It needs to be noted that most medieval maps weren't made to be literal geographical representations of the world, but rather a representation of the earth manifested in the divine order. It was more like a diagram. The church was enthusiastic about backing this concept of an earth-centric universe, which spread the idea all over because most European scientific research and exploration was provided and sponsored by the church itself. Which brings me to the next point. This is gonna sound absolutely cuckoo bananas, but the greatest sponsor of scientific research in the European Middle Ages was the church. I know, sounds crazy, but think about it. Who had plenty of money? The church. Who were the most highly educated among the populace? Monks and nuns most of the time. Well, and aristocrats, but they were too busy doing other things like warfare and petty bitchy drama. So progressivists in the 18th and 19th centuries created the myth of the medieval flat earth in part out of the idea that science and religion have always been at war with each other, which is simply not the case. There are plenty of other things that we can criticize the church for, and boy oh boy would I f***ing love to, but I gotta stay on track. But at least for the Middle Ages, science more often than not isn't one of them. The church was highly interested in scientific innovation in part because of how it could benefit the church. After all, science is what allowed people to build those beautiful, massive Gothic cathedrals with scientifically perfect acoustics for holy music. Windmills and watermills allowed monasteries to grind their own grain and oats, as well as for the local community. And navigational tools developed using the skills of Muslim thinkers were extremely important, and Muslim academics themselves were some of the world's leaders in scientific and mathematical thinking. A part of this is due to the fact that while ancient Greek and Roman texts fell out of use in the Christian world during the early medieval period, these texts were still in constant use by Muslim scholars and were therefore built upon over the course of many, many years. When those texts made their way back to the Christian world, kicking off the Renaissance, it was in part due to the translation and dissemination of them by, say it with me, Muslim scholars, who have been using them the whole time. Medieval Christians weren't ignorant to this gap in knowledge. They may have been highly intolerant to Islamic beliefs, but they knew when they were beat in the realm of science. The medieval Christian European world was much more influenced by and connected to the medieval Islamic world than is commonly believed. Famous church members, such as my medieval girlfriend Hildegard von Bingen, spent their lives making advancements in natural science, and though people believed that God had to be involved for any healing to occur, they still had many forms of medicine to the point where all cities and villages had an apothecary, and of course, doctors. Though the church did support a lot of scientific study, it still forbade autopsies, so knowledge of the inner workings of the human body were pretty limited and had to be learned via outside sources, like Greek or Muslim texts. Of course, the dominant medical ideology was that of the four humors, promoted by the first century physiologist Galen, which I've already talked about in previous videos, but sure, let's get into it. The four humors were yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm, which are supposedly the four fluids that make up your body, and in order to stay healthy, they all need to be in balance. If you were sick, step one was to figure out which humors were out of balance, and then you could attempt to treat it by supplying the body with things that are associated with that humor. The process is similar in some aspects to that of Chinese traditional medicine. The condition that ails you would be considered wet, dry, hot, or cold, in accordance to the humor it's affecting, and you could fix it by doing or consuming an opposite thing to balance it out. So, if your illness is apparently giving you too much blood, you need to eat something dry. And if that doesn't work, it's time for a super fun round of bloodletting. Wait, it didn't work? So clearly the fact that medicine hinged on this concept might pump the brakes on some medical advancement. But let's be real, that's not something confined to the Middle Ages. So we know people cared deeply about science. It was a different form of science, but it still had a system nonetheless, and one that the church cared about too. After all, to study the natural world was to admire the work of God. People didn't just forget how to read when the Roman Empire fell. Even if they couldn't write, and honestly, most people couldn't, many people knew how to read and taught their children as much when they had the time. Even though books weren't common in every household, Christian people still needed to be able to read in order to understand religious texts and read signs and records. Not only that, but both little boys and little girls were taught to read as well. Jewish and Muslim people, of course, were required to know how to read for the same reasons: religion, cultural emphasis on education, and day-to-day function. Of course, because of what I discussed earlier, those who joined a life in the church were among the most highly educated. Boys who entered a monastery were expected to master at least 7 subjects. And a lot of the time, it didn't even have to be theology as even one of those subjects. Students who thrived in academia could go on to become lawyers, teachers, ambassadors, or doctors. Though many children of nobles went into military service, quite often they would choose a life in the church almost purely for its access to education, such as Peter Abelard, one of the greatest academic minds of the era. Some young people may choose rather to become an apprentice, which, in my opinion, is something we might want to bring back in this economy. The apprentice's master would provide both vocational training as well as moral guidance, much like a parent, and in return, the apprentice does labor mostly in the realm of training. The apprentice would receive room and board, and maybe an allowance, and often was helped into formal schooling if they chose once the apprenticeship ended. But when we move back into the realm of the peasant and look at the literacy rate there, we have to take into account that medieval peasants lived in a world that revolved around material dominance. Things that you can see, hear, and touch. Abstractions, as in things you can only understand in your mind's eye, didn't have much bearing on the life of a peasant because they weren't necessary. We need to step back in instances like this and re-examine our biases. Are people somehow lesser for being illiterate, especially in a world where oral tradition functions just as well? Mind frames like this are what devalue the importance of things like oral histories in Indigenous groups. But we know that in Indigenous communities, keeping oral histories and stories alive is a very serious and important job. And the absence of written word doesn't change that. I mean, think about it. Medieval peasants kept track of a whole calendar without having it written down. Could you do that? Maybe most of them couldn't read, and even more couldn't write, but could you run your household and work the land without modern tech and navigate a feudal system? I don't know if I could. The world may have been incredibly small for the medieval peasant, but it's a small but incredibly complex world that functioned exactly how it needed to for the time period it existed in, for the most part. I can think of a few things that it wouldn't have hurt to improve upon. Anti-Semitism. The common idea of medieval food, at least in Europe, is a hunk of meat, some basic bread, cheese, and probably some stew of some sort. Of course, they did have all these things, but they weren't limited to it. Most peasants were serfs or land workers, meaning they were tied to farming and harvesting food on a lord's land. Even freemen had to rent land to work from the local lord, so all of the food people ate was locally grown. People had access to oats, wheat, barley, and other types of cereal grains. They could use these to make breads, porridges, pies, and pastries. Some bread or cakes were even made out of chestnuts or acorns. Was my collar flipped up this whole time? Uh-oh. But it wasn't just bread all the time. No sir, people also frequently ate fish, leeks, beans, onions, garlic, parsnips, and various fruits like apples, pears, citrus, and various herbs. And of course, eggs and cheese. Because various herbs and spices are extremely easy to grow in a home garden, even peasants had access to food flavorings like oregano, parsley, thyme, sage, and rosemary. Sorry to say though, to the dismay of all Renaissance fair enthusiasts out there, I'm sure, nobody ate giant turkey legs because turkeys are an American bird not yet brought over to Europe. But they did have street vendors, markets, bakeries, and tavern restaurants where you could get good food to bring home or take with you on whatever trip you needed to take that day, especially in larger cities. Not only that, but despite what medieval times will have you believe, people did have eating utensils. Yes, they did. While forks didn't become commonplace until the early modern period, people mostly ate with knives and spoons, and yes, their hands, when an item was fairly dry like bread. And it was very much expected that you wash your hands before eating every single time. People higher up in social class could afford to buy expensive spices brought in along trade routes from Africa and Asia. These routes were very extensive, more extensive in the Middle Ages than is commonly believed. In fact, these trade routes actually meant that many larger cities in the medieval period were pretty racially diverse. A lot of highly racist revisionist history written in the Victorian era birthed this concept of medieval Europe as a completely white bubble, but that's simply not the case, and we have plenty of artwork and records left behind to prove it. Speaking of artwork, do you perceive medieval art the same way as the person who made this comment on an article? They weren't good at drawing because they were too worried about being bludgeoned on the head by some warring noble. If your drawing was very lifelike, you'd be broken on the rack for witchcraft, so there might be that. Perhaps it was the fact that it was hard for the average lackey to get some colored pencils and paper from their local craft store. When looking for the next meal while starving, breaking out the old medieval easel and paints can be the last thing on one's mind. When you did manage to get a stale crust of dirty bread and a pot of leftover 10-day-old stew, it probably would be tough to draw when shitting your guts out. That toothache that was impossible to treat may affect your drawing aptitude. Perhaps the fact that an old drawing was not likely to ever be stored properly in the thatched piece of shit mud-walled hovel that so many lived in was a deterrent. Let's just say that different priorities probably influenced the drawing style. I don't even know where to begin with that one. This is another section where the modern perception of what is the right way to do something clashes with the worldview of the people who lived in the medieval era. You've probably looked at a weird medieval manuscript monster or a man-looking baby Jesus and thought, ugh, I guess they all forgot how to draw. First of all, allow me to quickly draw your attention to numerous medieval works that are absolutely artistically beautiful by modern standards. Second of all, medieval people simply had different priorities when it came to art. They were just not that interested in hyperrealism. They were drawn towards more symbolic representations of things and people, hence why there may be a group of people standing on a teeny tiny tall ship. The ship isn't important, the people are, so they're bigger than the ship. In the preceding era of the Roman Empire, a lot of art focused on realism and the beauty of human men as godlike figures. After Rome's fall and the rise of things like the Byzantine Empire, art shifted and looked dramatically as part of a reaction to Rome's embarrassing downfall, and the content focused on Christian themes because people considered art to be best used as a form of worship. This doesn't mean that all medieval art was religious though. During the Middle Ages, economic prosperity kinda went up and then way down. It grew for the most part until the Black Death took a massive hit to everywhere. But through this, one institution did pretty well and escaped mostly unscathed: the church. The church became extremely wealthy during the medieval period and was never too shy to spend a ton of dough on artwork, even when their parishioners were, dying, but it's for God, so it's fine. So they also had the money to preserve that art, and were less at risk of being raided or destroyed by invasions or war. So a lot of the secular art that was made during the time didn't usually have the means of protection to survive long enough for us to have it today. And even much of medieval art that looks fairly secular at first glance ends up being, for example, part of a Book of Hours, still a religious artifact. So not only does this discrepancy in protection and preservation make it look almost like all medieval art was religious, it also shows what art style was preferred by the people who had enough money to commission it, and for that matter, protect it. That's another good reason for this common look. A lot of art, if not most of it, was commissioned by wealthy clients who wanted their new pretty art thing to probably look a lot like this other pretty art thing that they saw someone else have. Art was a status piece, a way of showing your wealth. The wealthy wanted to conform. It wasn't considered brave or cool to do unheard of things the way it is today. Unless you're gay-ass Duke of Berry who commissioned a pretty unique Book of Hours. That medieval art style we all imagine was the popular style of the time. People could draw realistically, but is that as fun? Think of all the varied and unique art styles we see in art today. Don't you know what real people look like? Don't you know how to draw? No, most of us who aren't Lord Internet trolls don't say things like that about stylized art because it's art. Regardless of what, late Renaissance painters will have you believe, realism isn't the end-all be-all goal of art. So there you have it. Some medieval misconceptions, and I hope maybe you learned something today, and at the very least, come away from this video with a more nuanced view of the Middle Ages. There's a lot to learn from history when you take off the modern superiority goggles and try to understand why things were the way they were. Many things medieval people struggled with are the things that we still struggle with today, literally because of the mistake we make of believing we're superior. In many ways, we aren't. We're just different, and that's okay. And I think maybe things could be a lot better if we were all more okay with being different. So, don't forget to wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and if you are able, please vote.